Hello, my name is Mary Assad, and I'm a faculty member in the English department here at Case Western. Today, I am thrilled to be able to share with you some information regarding the NORD grant proposal that I have created in order to support innovative teaching in my first seminar course. So I'd like to review some of the background information and explain the purpose for what I hope to achieve with this grant. So the name of my project is Think Like an Artist, engaging CWRU students in multimodal communication. The reason I developed this project is because I am very interested in how students learn to write in different forms of communication. So for instance, different modes, such as visually, verbally, how they learn to combine words and images to create something that is meaningful for various audiences. And I'm also very interested in how students learn to adapt the content of certain written projects based on their audience and based on their audience's needs. So I also have taught at CIA previously. I teach writing courses there. And so I'm very familiar with some of the processes that art students use to come up with ideas, to generate creative concepts. And so I've always been fascinated by the ways in which CIA students and CWRU students often engage in overlapping or similar practices. So my project's purpose was to revise a current first seminar course, which I currently teach here for international students, by reframing the process of writing as an artistic endeavor, and also inviting students to see themselves as writers as well as creators. So I'm interested in what we can gain by helping students to think of themselves not just as a writer using words, but as a creator or as an artist who is using a much broader toolkit of communicative tools, essentially, to communicate with audiences and express something meaningful. So my goal is to empower students to learn, apply, and teach fundamental visual strategies used in comics art and transfer this knowledge to academic writing. So I'm very interested in comics, but I believe that some of the principles we use to teach analysis of comics and also production of comics can be used to also help students think about some of the principles involved in writing academic texts, so more traditional essays, research writing. It might seem like a stretch, but I do believe that some of those fundamental principles like audience awareness, rhetorical purpose, those are concepts that we can begin to cultivate in students by asking them to engage in multimodal communication practices. So I hope to improve students' ability to understand and produce nuanced and rhetorically situated academic writing. And I also kind of more broadly, I want to establish interdisciplinary and interinstitutional collaborations between Case Western and the Cleveland Institute of Art. And hopefully this is a collaboration that could continue for semesters or maybe even years to come. I also believe in the importance of cross-campus collaboration, and so I've established some collaboration with the KSL Friedman Center, which I'll talk more about. In terms of the project's deliverables, the students in this course create two major assignments that relate to the use of the grant funds. The first is creating a graphic memoir, which is essentially a memoir in comic book form, and it's modeled on texts that we read in our class, such as Persepolis, The Best We Could Do, and Pedro and Me. Those are our three main texts. So students then, after reading those, they create their own memoirs in a similar format. And the second thing that students create is a visual communication resource using the digital publishing platform called Scalar. And then this resource they will share with the CWRU as well as the CIA community. And the graphic memoir that I mentioned would be shared with the entire Case Western community at the Celebration of Student Writing and Research, which is a semesterly symposium that showcases the work students produce in their various writing courses. So these projects, the graphic memoir and the visual communication resource, lead to several different outcomes, including an improved student understanding of multimodal communication, improved student access to and engagement with digital composing tools, including Comic Life software and Scalar, improved student ability to understand and demonstrate effective writing, and also something a little more tangible, which is a digital and printed visual resource set. So the visual communication resources are being compiled and then shared publicly through digital and printed forms. And my hope for that is that those resources can be used as sort of a basis, as a living document that other instructors can then add to, change, develop, and it becomes something that we can all use to foster multimodal communication skills in our courses. And then ideally, I would also like to establish a framework for future CWRU-CIA collaborations. In terms of the logistics, I envision revising the curriculum for 2 sections of FSCC 100. Like I said, this is a first seminar course for non-native speakers of English. Typically, they enroll about 12 students per section. So these are smaller classes, and so we're able to combine these sections for some 4th-hour activities and also for some additional supplemental workshops and activities. So the theme of my course specifically is graphic memoir and the art of life writing. This is a theme that I created and used in the fall 2019 semester, and so I proposed with this grant to further develop and innovate that course for the spring 2020 semester, and then, hopefully use that model going forward. So the changes that I envision to this course involve developing the visual communication resource assignment that, again, involves using Scalar to create sort of a teaching tool that students need to teach visual communication strategies to others. And I'll give an example of that later on. And this uses Scalar in collaboration with the KSL Friedman Center. The second change is that students will have access to visual communication workshops that are beyond the scope of what I had previously offered to my students. So I want them to be able to learn comics vocabulary and cultural conventions that shape visual communication. And they do this presently, they've done this in the past, by reading and analyzing published graphic memoirs and crafting their own graphic memoirs using Comic Life. The change here is that they're going to have different workshops led not just by me, but also by an expert in art. And I also want them to be able to engage with some hand-drawn techniques to be able to understand some of the similarities and differences between digital and hand-drawn modes of communication in this context. And then I also want to develop and implement studio-style critiques of student work. So at CIA, studio-style critiques are very common, and they take place across the different majors. And students are familiar with that process. They understand what it means to attend a crit and what kind of feedback they can expect to get and how they're supposed to implement it. And in some ways, that's very similar to what we do in peer review workshops for writing classes, but there are some differences. And so that's sort of a style of feedback that I'd like to engage students around, particularly with the development of their graphic memoirs, which are artistic compositions. So the logistics also involve then, in order to achieve those goals, I would recruit and interview CIA students who I call student artists, because they're also artists. Many of them are working in the field already. They would be potential collaborators with this project, and they would come to class and really be embedded in our class as someone who significantly can work with students in these workshops that I would co-lead with the student. And then I would also ultimately select and collaborate with that student. So it's really important to me that the student is able to build rapport with my students and sort of foster the kind of dialogue that would be on a peer-to-peer level, which I think is valuable in its own sake. So student impact, I see this project improving student learning in 3 ways. First, students would learn and apply key visual strategies. Second, they would learn how to teach those strategies and related vocabulary to others. And then also they would learn cultural knowledge that will promote active engagement with American academic writing and also popular culture, due to the nature of some of the books we read and the concepts that we talk about related to visual communication. Also, CIA has generously offered use of some of their academic and creative spaces. So we would be able to go to CIA and use some of those spaces for our workshops, which I think would be a great opportunity for students. So overall, students are empowered to think not just as writers, but also as artists. And they would be able to consider how techniques such as line work, shading, color, and page layout create meaning for an audience. And then they're also invited to think about rhetorical situation and purpose, and to consider how the skills they're learning can be applied in future academic and workplace contexts. So the goal of this project is really to extend and expand upon some of the goals and the assignments that I've previously taught, but make them much more robust, much more innovative. And I'm really excited about what this can achieve, hopefully. So the grant funding, they will cover the expenses, including compensation for the CIA student, art supplies for some of those hand-drawn techniques that I want to work with, printing of students' work, of those 2 deliverables that I mentioned before, and then also just some workshop refreshments to foster a collegial environment for everybody. So in terms of the progress for this semester, as we all know, there have been some changes to the mode of teaching. So I was able to accomplish some things, but I've been a bit delayed with regard to some other aspects. So the first thing I did was I did work with Amanda at the KSL Friedman Center, and she was wonderful. She helped us to learn how to use Scalar, kind of walk through students through the process. And we had a series of workshops with her, both at KSL and in our classroom. So students were able to create a book. So each class has a book, and that book contains annotated pages from the graphic memoirs that we read this semester, from 2 of those memoirs, Pedro and Me and Persepolis. And I will show an example of that. So that was a really good, productive component of our class that was brand new this semester. I also spent time in March recruiting and interviewing CIA student artists. 2 of those candidates visited both of my FSCC sections, and they interacted with the students, which was really enjoyable. They asked questions, they talked to each other about art, about the differences between art school and a research university. And I was ready to proceed with a collaboration, but unfortunately we then had some circumstances that changed the nature of our instruction. So at this time, I could not proceed with the CIA student artist collaboration. However, I did learn some valuable insights through the process of recruiting and interviewing that I would apply in the future, such as the real value of having a good rapport between the student artist and the Case Western students, which I was able to witness during the days when those students came to my class. So at this point, no funds have been spent since the KSL collaboration did not incur any expenses. I look forward to being able to use the funds in the future for the expenses that I've outlined previously. So going forward, based on what happens at Case Western regarding our instructional mode, I hope to be able to proceed with the plan to work with the CIA student artist. However, if FSCC 100 does move forward in a remote format, I am going to envision ways that we could still work with that student artist, but using remote instruction. So potentially with Zoom workshops, and still finding ways to develop a model for workshops that would be engaging and interesting for students. And I honestly think that even if we couldn't be in person, it might be even more valuable for students to have the addition of this CIA student artist to help craft digital workshops that are as robust and as engaging as they can be. So I think this could really be something that's worth exploring going forward. And again, I'll be adapting to whatever the circumstances are that we see in the coming months. So at this point, I would like to share some sample student work briefly, just so you can get a sense of the types of graphic memoirs that students produced in the fall 2019 semester, and also see the visual communication resources, the inaugural versions of these that we created this semester with the help of the KSL Friedman Center. So I'm going to shift my view here a little bit and show you this first memoir was created by one of my students in the fall. And as you can see, students use photography as the basis of the images in their graphic memoirs. And some students choose to have a very realistic feel. So they don't apply any filters, they just use photographs as vivid and sharp as you see them here on the screen. So you'll see the student chose to write about college life and his sort of entrance into the Case Western community. And I unfortunately don't have time to show every page, but you can kind of get a sense of how he uses images to tell a story, along with the dialogue bubbles, some special effects text, thought bubbles, lots of pictures of his friends, captions. There's the use of humor. So we talk about kind of how text and images can work together to create meaning. It's something that we did in the fall semester. But going forward, I'd like to, again, let students have access to different tools and different ways for thinking about how they could format their pages, and importantly, how they can communicate meaning through this multimodal format. So that's one example. Another example here is a student's experience that was inspired by reading The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui, which is the story of a woman and her family and the experience of living through the Vietnam War and becoming refugees, coming to America during, I believe, like the 1970s. So this story was inspired by the memoir that we read, and my student chose to tell the story of his family and sort of trace the history of his ancestors in order to show how their experiences ultimately led him to become the person that he is today, and led him to be a first-year student at Case Western. So he chose to apply some filters, again, using the Comic Life software. So you can see how the images look a little bit different than the photorealistic ones that we saw in the previous memoir. He gives sort of some character introductions. He uses additional images and artistic elements to sort of filter and create a certain aesthetic feel for his pages. He uses some sort of full images without words, again, to have more visual symbolic meaning, which I thought was really interesting. Again, special effects text. We see, again, the dialogue. He really played a lot with perspective and looking at sort of how he could use angles and viewpoints to change the effect that the pages have on the reader. So again, going through, we have a nice little childbirth scene here. And then again, he uses the page to shift the timeline to talk about his father. So again, we see a different sort of approach to some of the visuals. He uses humor, as you might be able to see. And again, the student presented this work at the Celebration of Student Writing in the fall semester. So he was able to share this work and explain more about what inspired him and how he designed his pages. And again, I like this concluding page, which is the perspective of the road, which is on our lovely Case Western campus. So very briefly, one more example. The student chose to probably be the most abstract in terms of visual style. His cover here, he spent a lot of time photoshopping this image of a piano. And then he used black and white. He really wanted a black and white sketch look. So he used heavy filtering to change what was initially photographs into something that was a style that suited him and suited the story that he wanted to tell. So he tells a story about breaking a precious belonging of his mother and initially blaming that on somebody else and then learning a lesson from that experience. And you can see students know to abbreviate swear words. So one of the risks in projects like this is that you're inviting authentic student voices, which is great, but at the same time, sometimes dialogue and storytelling can involve some words that we might not necessarily want to see in our students' papers. So something that I think is fun about this assignment is seeing how students creatively handle that balance between formal writing and more conversational writing, like you'd see in a memoir. So again, this was also presented at the Celebration of Student Writing and Research last fall. Very briefly, I would like to show you the visual communication resource, which was created this semester for the first time, thanks to the collaboration, again, with the KSL Friedman Center. So what we did for this project is we scanned pages from the two of the memoirs that we read, Persepolis and Pedro and Me. And we did this at the Friedman Center in high resolution. And then we uploaded these with Amanda's help. We uploaded these to Scalar, and we created a book for each of my course sections. Once they were uploaded, Amanda taught us how to use the annotations feature to highlight certain portions of the pages and then create an analysis of that portion. So for the graphic memoirs, it's essential that we not just analyze them in essay form, but be able to use annotations to really call attention to certain specific visual elements that appear on certain parts of the page. So in this case, when you hover over a certain box, which may be a little difficult to see in the mode that I'm showing this, but if you hover over a certain box, a little green outline appears, and you can see that the student then was able to identify a visual strategy, which in this case was facial expression, and then provide an analysis as the content of that annotation. So we see facial expression here, you see hand positioning over here, and again in class we talked about these different strategies to consider how comics artists are able to use the visual medium as a form of communication through symbolic gestures and symbolic images. If we had access to workshops with our CIA student that we could have co-created, I would have been really interested to see how these analyses might look. Again, that's something I hope to do in the future. But this was just something that we were able to do with the assistance of KSL and the Friedman Center, which I think was just a fantastic resource. So I appreciate that very much. So this is one of the students' pages. And then the second page here, we get some images from Persepolis. So we can see facial expressions were something that the student really wanted to call attention to, looking at these portions of Persepolis. So at this point, I would like to just thank USite for the opportunity to have this grant and to be able to work with it and innovate my class. And I really look forward to seeing what will happen in the coming months as I'm able to adapt to the circumstances and hopefully still bring in a collaboration with the CIA student artist. So thank you again very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk further about this project if anyone would like to. Thank you again.